Welcome, dear listeners. The rain pours, the thunder growls, and the darkness feels alive. Tonight's story is my gift to you, a gentle thrill to lull you into slumber. Close your eyes, let the tale carry you, and drift into a restful night. Sleep well. Good night, friends. The apartment was quiet when I first stepped inside, save for the faint creak of floorboards beneath my shoes. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an old building, but it felt like home in a way nothing else had in years. The landlord, a wiry man with nicotine-stained fingers, and a voice that sounded like gravel, handed me the keys with a nod. "Welcome to 3B, he said, his tone indifferent. He didn't linger long after that, leaving me alone to unpack my meager belongings. I'd moved here to escape the noise of the city, the constant honking of cars, the chatter of crowds, the relentless hum of life pressing against me from every direction. This place promised solitude, tucked away at the end of a narrow street lined with trees whose branches clawed at the sky. From the moment I walked in, though, there was something about the apartment that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the dim light filtering through the cracked window panes, or the way the shadows seemed just a little too deep, pooling unnaturally in corners where they shouldn't have been. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. That's what happens when you're tired, isn't it? Your mind plays tricks on you. So I shrugged off the feeling and got to work setting up my new life. By nightfall, the apartment was starting to feel more lived in. Boxes were stacked neatly against the walls, furniture arranged haphazardly but functional enough. I sat down on the edge of the bed, running a hand over my face as exhaustion settled into my bones. Outside, the wind howled softly, rattling the loose pane above the fire escape. For a while, all I could hear was the steady rhythm of my own breathing, and then a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind again, sneaking through some unseen crack in the wall. But no, it was too deliberate, too close. A low murmur, barely audible, brushing against the edges of my hearing like fingertips trailing along skin. My heart quickened, and I froze, straining to catch the sound again. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The word hung in the air, unanswered. Silence stretched back, heavy and suffocating. But the shadows, they shifted, just a fraction, almost imperceptibly. And for the briefest second, I could have sworn one of them moved toward me. The next morning, I woke up groggy and disoriented, sunlight streaming through the cracks in the blinds. The events of the previous night felt distant now, like fragments of a dream slipping through my fingers. Had I really heard a whisper, or had it been nothing more than fatigue playing tricks on me? I shook off the thought and went about my day, unpacking boxes, organizing the kitchen cabinets, even taking a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. The streets were quiet, lined with aging brick buildings and overgrown bushes that seemed to swallow the sidewalks whole. There was a certain charm to the area, but also an undercurrent of neglect, as if time itself had forgotten this part of the city. When I returned to the apartment later that evening, the unease crept back in almost immediately. The air inside felt heavier somehow, colder, despite the warmth of the late summer night. I flicked on the lights, half expecting something to jump out at me, but everything appeared normal. Boxes still stacked neatly against the walls, furniture untouched. Nothing amiss. But then I noticed it, the shadow by the window. It wasn't cast by anything obvious. No lamp or overhead light could account for its shape. It stretched long and distorted across the floor, darker than the others, almost liquid-like in its movement. My pulse quickened as I stared at it, unable to look away. Slowly, deliberately, it shifted, not because of any change in the light, but as if it had a will of its own. "Okay," I muttered to myself, backing away toward the kitchen. "You're just tired. Get a grip." I grabbed a glass of water and forced myself to sit down at the table, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Shadows don't move on their own. That's not how physics works. But even as I repeated these thoughts like a mantra, doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. What if it wasn't just a trick of the light? What if there was something else here with me? Later that night, after turning off all the lights and climbing into bed, I tried to push the idea out of my head. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by faint sounds that I couldn't quite place. Soft rustling, muffled footsteps, whispers so low they might have been imagined. Each time I opened my eyes, the room was empty, the shadows still. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. This time, the whisper was clearer, closer. A single word, barely audible but unmistakable: help. My body jolted awake, heart pounding wildly in my chest. I sat up, scanning the darkened room for the source of the voice. The clock on the bedside table read 3:17 a.m., the numbers glowing faintly in the gloom. Everything else was silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. No response, just the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing down on me. Then I saw it, the shadow near the doorway. It wasn't just moving anymore. It was forming shapes, twisting and writhing like smoke caught in a breeze. It began to take on a vaguely human outline. Arms reaching, legs bending, a head tilting ever so slightly to one side. And then it spoke. Not with words exactly, but with a sound that reverberated in my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. A chorus of voices layered over each other, some pleading, others angry, all of them desperate. They weren't speaking to me, they were speaking through me, using me as a conduit for whatever message they were trying to deliver. I clapped my hands over my ears, shaking my head violently. "Stop! Stop it!" I shouted, though I knew it wouldn't do any good. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the rules of the physical world. Finally, mercifully, the voices faded, leaving behind only silence. The shadow dissolved back into the darkness, retreating to the corners of the room where it belonged, or so I hoped. Trembling, I reached for the lamp beside my bed and switched it on, flooding the space with harsh yellow light. For a while, I sat there, wide-eyed and breathless, staring at the walls as if expecting them to come alive. When nothing happened, I convinced myself it was safe to lie back down. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, kept me on edge. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I needed answers. This wasn't just my imagination running wild. It was something real, something tangible, and I had a sinking suspicion that the key to understanding it lay within the apartment itself. The next day, I decided to investigate. The whispers, the shifting shadows, they weren't random. There had to be a reason why this apartment felt so wrong. I started with the obvious places: closets, cabinets, under furniture, anything that might hold clues about what, or who, was haunting my new home. I began in the living room, where the shadow had first appeared by the window. Kneeling down, I examined the baseboards and walls for anything unusual: scratches, discoloration, hidden compartments. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but when I pressed against one of the panels near the floor, it gave way slightly, revealing a narrow gap behind it. My heart raced as I pried the panel loose with a butter knife from the kitchen. Behind it was a small hollow space, just big enough to fit a shoebox, and inside, a dusty old journal, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. My hands trembled as I opened it, flipping through brittle pages filled with cramped handwriting. The entries were dated decades ago, written by someone named Eleanor. She described strange occurrences in the apartment, whispers in the dark, objects moving on their own, feelings of being watched. Her words grew increasingly frantic as the months passed, detailing sleepless nights and growing paranoia. One passage stood out: "They're here, in the shadows. They watch me constantly, waiting for something. I don't know what they want, but I can feel them getting closer. If anyone finds this, please help me. Please tell them I'm sorry." The final entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted, or worse. A chill ran down my spine as I closed the journal. Whoever Eleanor was, her story mirrored my own experience almost exactly. Was she the previous tenant? Had she left this behind hoping someone would find it? And most importantly, what had happened to her? Determined to learn more, I called the landlord. His gruff voice answered after several rings. "Yeah," he barked. I found something in my apartment, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. An old journal hidden in the wall. Do you know anything about it? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, tinged with unease. Look, kid, some stuff goes down in those old buildings. People move in, people move out. Sometimes they leave things behind. Just don't go poking around too much, all right? His evasiveness only fueled my curiosity. Who lived here before me? I pressed. A woman named Eleanor. Another pause. Then that place has been empty for years. No one's lived there since. He trailed off, muttering something unintelligible before hanging up abruptly. Frustrated but undeterred, I turned my attention back to the apartment. If the landlord wasn't going to give me answers, I'd have to find them myself. I spent the rest of the afternoon searching every inch of the space, looking for anything else Eleanor might have left behind. It wasn't until I checked the closet in the bedroom that I found something truly unsettling. Behind a stack of forgotten cleaning supplies, tucked into the far corner, was a collection of Polaroid photos. Each one showed the same woman, young, with wide eyes and an anxious smile, standing in various parts of the apartment. Some were harmless enough, her sitting on the couch, standing by the window, cooking in the tiny kitchen. But others made my blood run cold. In one photo, she stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring directly at the camera, while her actual face remained turned away. In another, the edges of the frame were blurred, as if something or someone had moved quickly past the lens. And in the last photo, taken close enough to see every detail, her expression was pure terror. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her hands raised as if warding off an unseen attacker. On the back of the final photo, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were 2 words. Don't trust the shadows. I stared at the image for a long time, my mind racing. What did it mean? Who or what was in the shadows? And how could I protect myself from something I couldn't even see? As night fell once again, I realized I was no closer to understanding what was happening to me. All I knew was that the whispers were growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just asking for help anymore. Now they were demanding it, and they wanted something from me. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. Every shadow seemed alive, writhing and twisting, like living things, mocking me from the corners of the room. The whispers were relentless now, a constant hum in the background that grew louder whenever I tried to ignore them. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were forming words, sentences, fragmented pleas. Help us. Let us out. You're next. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the journal and the Polaroids tightly in my hands, as if they could somehow shield me from whatever was closing in. My mind raced with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. What did Eleanor mean when she wrote "No trust, but don't trust the shadows"? Who or what was trapped in them? And why had they chosen me? The air in the apartment felt heavier than ever, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. I glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. The numbers flickered faintly, as if struggling to stay lit. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows violently. Something about the sound sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't natural. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from somewhere else entirely. Then, without warning, the power went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, leaving me blind and disoriented. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, almost deafening. They surrounded me, coming from every direction, overlapping and colliding, until they became a cacophony of voices. And then, the shadows moved. Not subtly, not slowly. They surged forward like liquid darkness, pooling together into shapes that loomed over me. Humanoid figures formed before my eyes, their outlines jagged and unnatural. Their faces were featureless voids, but I could feel their gaze boring into me, pinning me in place. Panic surged through my veins. I scrambled backward, fumbling for the flashlight I'd left on the bedside table. When my fingers finally closed around it, I switched it on, pointing the beam wildly at the figures. To my horror, The light didn't dispel them. It only made them recoil slightly, hissing like animals caught in the sun. One of the figures stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, its head tilted to one side, and though it had no mouth, I heard its voice inside my head, cold and sharp. "You shouldn't have looked. What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. "What did Eleanor do?" The figure paused, as if considering my question. Then it raised an arm, pointing toward the far wall of the bedroom. The plaster there began to crack and splinter, revealing a dark cavity behind it. A low guttural growl emanated from within, accompanied by the stench of damp earth and decay. My legs trembled as I forced myself to stand. Whatever was in that hole, it wasn't human, but I knew I had no choice. I had to see it. If I wanted answers, if I wanted to survive, I had to face whatever was waiting for me. With shaking hands, I approached the opening in the wall. The flashlight's beam barely penetrated the darkness inside, illuminating jagged edges and twisted roots that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. As I leaned closer, I saw something that made my stomach churn. Rusty, ancient chains embedded deep into the walls holding back something. And then I heard it, a low guttural breathing, slow and deliberate. Something was chained up in there, bound by forces beyond my understanding. But it wasn't alone. Dozens of voices whispered from the abyss, pleading, begging, screaming. "We're trapped," they said. "Free us." "No," I whispered, backing away. "No, I can't. You must." The shadow figure hissed, cutting me off. "Or you'll join us." Before I could react, the figure lunged at me, its form dissolving into smoke as it wrapped itself around my body. I fell to the floor, gasping for air as icy tendrils slithered across my skin, seeping into my pores. Images flooded my mind. Eleanor, screaming as the shadows consumed her. The landlord, covering up the truth. Countless others who had lived here before, their faces twisted in agony. And then I understood. The shadows weren't just haunting the apartment. They were prisoners, bound to this place by some ancient force. Eleanor hadn't been their victim. She'd been their jailer. And now they wanted me to take her place. As the realization hit me, the pressure in my skull intensified, forcing me to my knees. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single deafening roar. "Free us!" Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I crawled toward the chains. If breaking them meant freeing the shadows, and possibly unleashing hell, I couldn't do it. But maybe there was another way. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my phone. Its screen glowed faintly, casting a pale light over the chaos. With trembling fingers, I opened the camera app and pointed it at the shadows. As soon as the lens captured them, they recoiled, shrieking in pain. Light, it seemed, wasn't enough, but technology could hurt them. Desperation fueled me as I snapped photo after photo, each flash momentarily banishing the figures back into the walls. One by one they retreated, dissolving into nothingness until only silence remained. When it was over, I collapsed onto the floor, drenched in sweat and utterly drained. The apartment was still again. The oppressive weight lifted, for now. But I knew the shadows weren't gone. They were waiting, biding their time. Because sooner or later, someone else would come looking for answers. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the blinds, painting the apartment in soft hues of gold and orange. For the first time since I'd moved in, the space felt still, quiet. The oppressive weight that had clung to every corner of the room was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that left me both relieved and uneasy. I sat on the floor where I'd collapsed hours earlier, my phone still clutched tightly in my hand. Its battery was nearly drained from the endless photos I'd taken, but it didn't matter. It had saved me, or so I hoped. My mind replayed the events of the night over and over again, each memory sharper than the last. The whispers, the shadows, the chains hidden behind the wall. It all felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But the scratches on my arms and the lingering chill in the air were proof enough that it had been real. I knew I couldn't stay here. This place wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Whatever force Eleanor had tried to contain was still lurking beneath the surface, waiting for its next victim, and I refused to be that person. Gathering what little strength I had left, I began packing my things. Boxes that had only recently been unpacked were hastily refilled, clothes thrown into suitcases, books stacked haphazardly. I didn't care about leaving anything behind. This apartment had already taken too much from me. As I worked, I kept glancing at the journal and the Polaroids scattered on the bed. They were evidence of what had happened here, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But they also felt dangerous, like holding on to them might invite the shadows back. In the end, I decided to take them with me, not because I wanted reminders, but because someone needed to know the truth. When everything was packed, I stood in the middle of the empty apartment one last time. The sunlight streaming through the windows made it look almost peaceful, as if nothing sinister had ever occurred within these walls. But I knew better. The shadows were patient. They would wait until the next tenant arrived, unsuspecting and unprepared. With a deep breath, I turned and walked out, locking the door behind me. The key felt heavy in my pocket, a final tether to the nightmare I was leaving behind. I dropped it into the landlord's mailbox on my way out, along with a note: "Don't rent this place again, ever." Weeks later, I found myself sitting in a small cafe, miles away from the city, staring out the window as rain streaked down the glass. The journal lay open on the table in front of me, its pages worn and fragile. I hadn't read it since that night, too afraid of what I might find. But today, I felt ready. Flipping through the entries, I noticed something I'd missed before. A single line scribbled in the margins of the final page. "If you can see them, they've already chosen you." A chill ran down my spine. I closed the journal quickly, shoving it back into my bag. The rain outside picked up, tapping against the window like impatient fingers. For a moment I thought I heard it again. The whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Help." I froze my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Slowly, I turned my head, scanning the cafe. The other patrons went about their business, oblivious. No one else seemed to hear it, but I did, and deep down I knew the shadows weren't done with me yet.